Leonard Cheshire, in conversation with Sophie Morgan.
Good evening. My name is Selena Mills. I work at Leonard Cheshire and I am your host for this evening. And I have to say, I absolutely love this part of my job because it's the best bit. It lets us show what we do, what we think about at Leonard Cheshire. So the first thing I have to say, or even I've said it again, thank you. Thank you for being here. And whether you support us with your time, your ideas, funds, we just love it when people come together and we think about what we can do and what we do best. And that is supporting disabled people around the world. Before we get going today, I just want to give a bit of housekeeping. Unfortunately, it's not like being in an aeroplane. There are no exits. You can turn off. But the event is being recorded and will be circulated afterwards. There are some people who couldn't join us tonight and they would love to see it afterwards. So we will record. There will be live captions throughout. And there's a little sign there which will give you a way to access them. We have our wonderful BSL interpreters with us. They change every 15 minutes. And if you're having any issues, just send us a quick message on the Q&A function on your Zoom. So the chat function is disabled. So the thing you're going to look for is the Q&A function on your screen. And we have an amazing team behind the screens who are monitoring this, including Lucy, who will be having a look at your questions and your comments throughout this evening. And just to let you know, we've kind of made sure there's time at the end of this hour to get your questions to the floor, to talk to Sophie and to Ruth and to Libby. And we will try and be good and keep to the hour. So forgive us if we don't get all your questions in. I know there's going to be many. So hopefully you're now sitting comfortably with some tea, or should I say other liquid refreshment of your choice. And let me give you the layout of the next hour and what we're doing here today. So the reason we call this the conversation is because unlike a straightforward Q&A, our aim is to get to know our guests and share our stories and to welcome you all in with your own questions along the way. And tonight we have three wonderful guests. We have Leonard Cheshire's very own Ruth Owen, who's our CEO. We have the phenomenal Sophie Morgan, the award-winning journalist and activist, and so much more. And we have Libby Parfitt, the amazing writer and disability campaigner, and stories about tanks that I don't even want to go there. Anyway, I am your host, and just so you know, I'm legally blind. So if any of my guests are waving at me, yeah, great. Just yell my name if you need me. So this evening, we're going to talk about the personal impact of disability. And I'm going to introduce our Global Ambassador in a minute, Sophie Morgan, to join the conversation and to think about what the personal impact of disability does mean, really. As some of you know, Sophie is an award-winning TV presenter for Channel 4, and she's recently come back from the Paralympics in Tokyo. She's a successful artist, a consultant across various industries on diversity and inclusion, and she talks very candidly about her life and how a car crash when she was 18 changed about everything, but not the person she is. So apart from her television work, she also campaigns for disabled people, particularly around education, transport, retail, and fashion. And she, just so you know, I didn't know this until I got to know her, she designed, she keeps it quite quiet, the first ever wheelchair mannequin in retail stores. So when you go past like Marks and Spencer's and you see a mannequin in a wheelchair, that's from Sophie. I don't know if it's M&S though. But most important, away from that, is Sophie is our Global Ambassador for Inclusive Education and Women. And in 2019, she traveled with us to Kenya to deliver some citizen workshops, which I hope she'll tell us a little bit more about when she talks later. We are so happy to have you with us here, Sophie. Welcome.
Thank you, Selena. I wish you could introduce me everywhere I went.
I'll just cut anytime. But Sophie, welcome back from Tokyo. And how was the Paralympics?
Thank you, Selena. It was good. It was, as always, I suppose, refreshing, groundbreaking, exciting. I think as a presenter, it was really fun. But more as a disabled person and a disability advocate, it was refreshing in the sense that it was just good to see disabled people back in the mainstream narrative again.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, I have my concerns that we do just drop out of that mainstream narrative once the game's finished. But nevertheless, I think we took that opportunity as a community and grasped it and ran with it. And some really exciting things happened. We saw the launch of some huge disabled campaigns like We the 15, and we saw some exciting stuff happen. So I think the games were a success. And for Channel 4, they certainly were. We had more disabled talent on screen than ever before, more hours of television broadcast and of live parasport than ever before. So I think it was a success all around, really.
And what have you been doing since you got back? Because I imagine you were a bit of a high after the Paralympics, because it's sort of getting out, getting on a plane, going somewhere. What have you been doing since you've got back?
Yeah, you're right. It was. I mean, honestly, just the getting on the flight in itself was such a experience. It had been such a long time. Quite intimidating, actually. But great to be out and about. So yeah, since I've got back, a number of things really. I've started filming a new series for Channel 4. Another series is going into recommission in January. I've just launched a new podcast called Equal To, which has just been put out, which was made by the Emmy Award-winning team behind the Netflix documentary called Rising Phoenix.
I love that. Yeah, that's brilliant.
Yeah, it's a fantastic documentary, and the team behind that were looking to sort of say, right, what is next in the conversation around disability equality, and how do we achieve equality too? So I hosted and executively produced that podcast, and that went out just last week last month. And then I've also got my book coming out. So I'm busy prepping that, going through the processes of just, bringing out my first book, which is absolutely terrifying and exhilarating all at the same time. So there's a lot going on.
That's really, I won't ask you about your book because I know one of my guests wants to talk to you about your books. But if they don't, I'm jolly well going to come back and ask you. And you and I have long talked about that. One of the things, I'm kind of going to go a bit personal now. So, you can get rude and grumpy if you want. Never. What I'm struck about is I was reading, as a good researcher does, some of your interviews. And in the Times, there was a lot, you did a piece where you were talking about where you were never sort of understanding that you were coming to terms with not being able to walk again. And then you quote, this is what you said, I thought was very interesting. That's nothing, you said, it's everything else. And I guess what we feel at Leonard Cheshire is absolutely that. I totally agree. I'm disabled myself, but it's not just me, it's all of us. It's not the disability that holds you back, but the way society sees you and creates barriers.
Yeah.
Was it a shock to suddenly be seen as different and other, having never had that feeling before? Or did you feel like that?
No, well, I think I'll break it down into two areas, this experience, and why I said what I said, which was that yes, walking is just losing the ability to walk was really quite a small part of the adjustment when it came to adapting to my disability. So to explain, I had a car crash when I was 18 and I was paralyzed from the chest down. And in the process of rehabilitating and kind of going back into the world, I carried with me quite a lot of my own internalized ableism, which has taken me quite a long time to unpack and see, and where that played out and how that impacted me was complicated. And I think anyone listening who has ever experienced that for themselves will understand just how hard that can be to identify. I mean, for example, I was the first disabled person that I had ever met. So when I met myself, I was very much my perceptions of what someone like me could do were very limited. I had a lot of, I suppose, prejudicial beliefs around disability. I didn't know much about it, and I had no idea what I could do. So my perception of myself was one challenge that I had to come to try and learn how to overcome. But yes, the other, being seen as other, and I'll never forget the first, experiences of realizing that the girl that I was and the girl that I had become, even though really all that had happened in many ways outwardly was I just was now moving around in a wheelchair and not using my legs. Suddenly everything was different. The way I was treated, the way that people treated the people around me, their access to, I don't just mean the physical access, I mean, that's just really quite basic. It was so many of the other barriers that I didn't have a clue existed for disabled people. And that was a brutal shock, brutal and heartbreaking shock, especially for a young woman who prior to my injury had been very independent, very strong-willed, very capable. And then so all of a sudden, all of these traits that I identified myself as having and as being, I'd lost. And it took me a long time to work out how to find my identity again in the face of all these barriers that were really, very high and continue to be.
Can I just ask you, because maybe some of our listeners will not know, what does the word ableism mean?
So ableism, it's a great question, because ableism is really the discrimination against people that are not a certain type of body. We break it down into, we use it in our community for the sort of non-disabled people that might see disabled people as lesser or disabled people as other. And but it crosses over into other areas of society where ableism can be applied as well. And in the context of disability, I'll give an example. It's the idea that really, if you have a disability, there's a drive to want to fix it, cure it, change it, get rid of it.
Yes.
And that is something that I think we carry inside of us a little bit. So when I first had my injury, there was a real drive to want to get rid of it. And that's quite natural, I think. But I think it was very much of a hindrance, because for a long time I fought against my reality and tried constantly to think that I'm never going to be good enough unless I can walk. But really, of course I can be good enough. I just have to get around in a different way now. And it's a huge question, Selena, and I can only scratch the surface here. I would encourage anybody who didn't understand my definition, or I didn't do the definition justice, but B is curious, to research this, because I think it's an area we don't know enough about. And it's a word that I have to say myself, I didn't really even actually understand or use until very recently. And I would also say something that's quite interesting is there aren't many translations in other languages for the word ableism. In some countries, that word doesn't even exist. So
I totally agree on the basis that so I'm losing my sight and I can't have it operated on. And I've had exactly the same conversation. I'm like, surely you can have laser. Surely you can do this. Surely. And you're like, well, actually, not only no, but I'm actually quite happy where I'm with who I am. But I think the word, I didn't know about it actually until I worked for Leonard Cheshire, is that it's society's barriers, and you blame yourself. I don't know about you, but I certainly blame myself for not, matching society's image of what I should be. And then you realize it's actually not anyone's fault. It's implanted in society. Absolutely. And it's something that we've got to learn. Which brings me to my next question, actually. So, you've been voted, interestingly, one of Britain's top 10 disability leaders. And it's not just about your own experiences, but also the fact that you're very much out there helping and supporting others. So in order to kind of talk about things like ableism and otherness and being treated differently, what are the biggest issues facing disabled people? And you don't have to do it all, because I know it's impossible to do it all, but where would you start if you were going to sort of rule the world? Where would you start at the moment?
Oh, Selena, what a question. So to your
point,
where can we go with this? Because there's so many issues.
Well, let's go to employment.
I was going to say, the one I would start with, I think is so important, is in employment, because ultimately, at the moment, there's nearly over 14 million people, the disabled people in the UK. And last I checked, only about just over 4 million of those people were in work. I think the reality is you are twice as likely to be unemployed if you're disabled than if you're not disabled. And the other realities that we need, the nuances that we need to bring into this conversation, are things like the extra costs that disabled people face. Yeah. We, on average, have to spend an extra £500 more, nearly £600. I think it's £580 a month just to be disabled. Then to bear in mind that we have got the extra issues around access to housing and transport. And okay, so this is where it starts to get, there's so much to this conversation. But if we are able to have more focused conversations around how we can get disabled people into employment, so many of these issues will start to almost crumble. I feel the barriers, imagine I see a barrier as a brick wall. With more and more disabled people in positions of power, those brick walls will start to come down. So the areas where I feel we need as a community to see traction and see change is, I feel, in accurate representation, in stronger leadership, and in more sort of, so accurate representation, stronger leadership, and there's the third one, and my brain's gone dead. Those are my favorite three. Increased visibility. Okay, so those three areas where we can start to see disabled people in those spaces, almost by default, we'll start to see the changes around things like ableism. So for example, we don't have to, if we see disabled people in boardrooms and we see disabled people in areas where they're in recruitment, for example, we don't have to educate or raise awareness around how people might have unconscious biases, or might have, discriminative practices, or might be internalizing ableism that is preventing them from seeing a disabled person as employable, because the disabled people themselves will be making those choices. So this is where it's
we could talk for hours.
We could go for hours into this, but
I know. I'm going to be quite strict because unfortunately our time is limited. What I was thinking about, which is everything you said absolutely strikes a chord, particularly with, I think, Leonard Cheshire. And I would like to bring in our chief executive, Ruth Owen, who I think you've met before, and open up the conversation a bit. Just for you guys who don't know or haven't met our CEO, Ruth is one of the most passionate people I've ever met about disabled people's rights. And before joining us, she was the CEO of WizKids, which changed literally fundamentally how young people got access to wheelchairs. And it's now the largest provider of wheelchairs outside the NHS. Ruth, when I think you heard on the grapevine that we were going to ask Sophie, you were very eager to join us this evening. And I know you have your own questions. So I will put myself on mute and hand over to you, Ruth.
Thanks, Selena. And yes, I was delighted to meet Sophie, because we're neighbours, aren't we, Sophie?
We are. We bumped into each other on our little bikes outside the river. We both got wheelchair attachments, and we were like, zoom, whoa, look who it is.
Whoa, we go, oh, there's each other. I'm zooming off this way and Sophie's zooming off the other way. But, listen, I'm delighted to join in. I'm a massive fan of Sophie, and always liking her stuff on Instagram and what she's doing on the TV. So thrilled to be with you. And I'd met you some time ago, even before I joined Leonard Cheshire, when we sat next to each other all those moons ago at a dinner. And I guess what struck me is that, you were going to study law before your accident, and then you changed to, going to Brighton and studying art. Do you think, what influenced that decision? Do you think it was the right decision for you?
So yes, so I get asked this question quite a lot, and I find it really interesting because I in the years since I became I was going to be studying I wanted to study law, and after my woke up after my spinal injury, I sort of had one of those moments of life is too short, do what you love, follow your heart. And for me, that passion lay in art, and so I put those ambitions to be a lawyer to one side and went and became an artist. So I studied fine art. But I have to say, one of the first things I learned when I came out of hospital and went to art school, which, by the way, was completely inaccessible. When I arrived at art school, I was actually told, I'm afraid you can't come here because there's no access. And what was the first thing I had to do? I had to find a lawyer. So I realized very quickly, I was like, oh, hold on, have I made the right choice here? Maybe I should be actually flexing that sort of advocate muscle and becoming a lawyer or an activist, because that's how I'm going to get ahead. I'm going to have to use my rights. I'm going to have to know my rights. So there was always been a bit of a confliction, should I have done that? Should I have done that? But I always circle back to this belief that at the heart of some of the most extraordinary disabled people that I've ever met, and the most successful disabled people I've ever met, is an overwhelming amount of creativity. And I feel that my creative skills were honed a lot at art school, and I may not spend my life being an artist now. I mean, I draw and I paint for fun, but at the heart of all the work I do is that creative passion. And so in many ways, I see my life almost as a piece of art. I'm like, how do I use my creative energy? And I'm sure you would but all agree, I see you nodding, Selena, that disabled people use creativity in ways that I feel just, they are all artists. I mean, the way you have to get to work, the way you have to wake up in the morning, the things you have to do is just, it takes so much imagination, so much, you know, we see the world in a different way, I feel. So I almost feel I'm an artist whether I like it or not, and I'm in many ways an activist whether I like it or not. Do you know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah, and I think you're amazing at both. And what would you, you know, many of the young people we work with, you know, not in employment, not in education, don't believe in themselves. And I met many young people through my time at WizKids where, you know, they were really struggling to see their place in the world, and you know, didn't know, you know, didn't see people like you and I working. Who was a person that you looked up to, and, you know, why did you look up to them? And give me a sense of who helped you along your journey. So
without a shadow of a doubt, the beginning stages of my adapting to life, but I was only 18, right? So I was only a baby. I didn't really know what I was doing other than I wanted to do art and be happy, and, you know. But when I started to decide that I wanted to go places, and I didn't really know what that meant, the person that was always completely supportive, 100% encouraging was my mum. And my family by extension, but very much my mum. You can do this, and if you can't do it, we'll find a way. But what she really did was lay the foundations, because at the time there was so few role models out there. We didn't have social media. I didn't have anyone on the telly. I didn't, you know, Ruth, you'll remember that time. It's a good 20 years ago. There was very little representation. So I didn't really see other people, but the minute I did see other people like me, they quickly became my inspiration. And I still to this day hold in very high esteem and follow and aim to replicate and tread in the footsteps of, so to speak, as a wheelchair user, so many disabled advocates that from all around the world, that I see as role models. And I'm so grateful now that I have those people in my life, and that other young disabled people have them too, in abundance. There's so many. Social media is swarming with incredible people. So
it's amazing. And I know I follow many of them on Instagram, and like you, my mum was my biggest supporter, and actually the biggest person in my life that made me the woman I am today. And I'm extremely grateful for that.
Just to your point, actually, I don't know if I really answered one of them, the questions you asked there, Ruth, but one thing I would say is, if you are a young person looking for that inspiration, trying to find that confidence, if you aren't as privileged as it sounds Ruth and I are to have a support network around you immediately, what you do have now is a social media world in which I feel you can lean on others and look for support. There are so many networks and ways of reaching out to find other people like yourself, or, you know, so I that's why I kind of made that point later, because I think it's important for people to realize that if your family aren't supportive, or if your family don't get it, if you don't have that support network, there are other ways of finding it.
Definitely. And I think that's what's wonderful about the disabled community online, which I know I'm part of many of those communities as well, like you are, Sophie. Now, I've spent, as a young person, I spent a huge amount of time in Africa. I spent a long time because my family lived there. And I know you had a trip to Kenya, and I always have, you know, really strong feelings and wonderful experience of Africa. Tell me what you learned from our citizens reporting workshops. You know, tell me what lasted with you from your trip in 2019.
Yeah, it was such an amazing trip. I think, well, firstly, just for me to understand just how much Leonard Cheshire do, it was an area I hadn't really appreciated or had much understanding of, you know, just where your work and your efforts lie outside of the UK and what you do. And so when I went over to Kenya, I had such an amazing experience, firstly learning about everything, all the projects that go on over in Kenya. But one of the experiences was, doing a workshop. And so I ran a workshop with, I think there must have been about maybe 20 young people from with various different disabilities, whether they be sensory or physical. There was a whole range of young people there, but all of them were so keen to become advocates and so keen to try and shift the narrative in their community, or dreaming big in the world. They're really ambitious, really tenacious young people that wanted to sort of learn what had I done over in the UK that had given me a platform. What were the steps that I had taken, and when I had got that voice, how did I use it? So we just did some really practical lessons throughout the day. I was talking to them about how to use social media, ways in which using language to articulate your experience, because at the end of the day, this is about being an advocate. It's about communication, and so often we see barriers in communication. And I don't mean that just if you have a disability that impedes your ability to communicate. I actually mean just across the board. It's very difficult to often articulate the lived experience of disability, and that's what we need to do to gain greater empathy, to then in turn sort of encourage and create change. So we broke that down, and I spent a lot of time talking to the different young people about where their lives had been negatively impacted by their disabilities, how their communities saw them, and how they had found a way around that to even be in the room in that space, and then how we could use that to use that strength and use that learning to kind of galvanize them, to take them further. And it was a really amazing experience. It really was wonderful. Incredible young people.
Ruth, would you mind if I butted in a
Oh,
little bit?
feel free.
Go for it. I wanted to say, I remember Sophie going on this trip, and it was phenomenal. And I particularly remember, didn't you go to a workshop where they had the fathers of communities, where the father would actually help make a decision about what happened to their disabled daughters? And it was sort of trying to shift people's notion, not just with people who are disabled, but the families around them. So I remember hearing about that from you.
That was amazing. It really was. And I would say if anybody watching or listening now wants to learn more about that, there's a lot on this Leonard Cheshire website about the experience that we had. I
didn't prime her. Well done. I did not prime you. That's very good.
There was a group of men who had recognised that often in the communities that we were in, young disabled women particularly would be targeted, and often for the most darkest of reasons, which I won't go into. It was really quite disturbing, but young disabled women were very, very vulnerable in these rural communities that we were in. And so a group of dads had come together to take control of this situation, and to try and, instead of shun their disabled daughters, which often seemed to be the way that things would work out, they decided not to do that, and they took pride and ownership of their daughters' vulnerabilities, and they wanted to try and help. And so they would do workshops, they would do outreach, they just created a supportive network so that their daughters wouldn't feel so vulnerable, and that the mothers of the daughters weren't left with the responsibility of young women that really they couldn't handle. It was very, very, very moving. But the mothers as well, and then the teachers or the communities that came together to protect these young disabled women, to enable them to go further, to get into education, and then dream bigger. Yeah. Oh, it's extraordinary. And Leonard Cheshire's work around that to facilitate that was amazing.
I think it's our hidden treasure, actually.
I would agree.
I just want to open the conversation even wider. So we've got Ruth, we've got Sophie, but another incredibly strong woman who's joining us this evening is Libby, and Libby Parfitt, who's our third guest. I have to say, there's not enough time to tell you about Libby, but Libby has a fascinating background, which includes a year in Nepal volunteering, a successful TV production career, also, which she only told us last week, and we're now totally fascinated. She did a program that documented starting a new country, and she took a big armored tank, to 10 Downing Street. So she's going to tell us more about that later. I will not blow her thunder. She also talks about how her life changed in 2011 when a trip literally over a broken pavement changed her life beyond recognition. And in rebuilding her life, she's now a leading journalist, and she writes a blog, an inspirational blog, and I know she can tell you about the word inspirational, for thousands of people who have chronic pain. And we are very lucky to have her with us. In 2018, she got involved with our employment campaign and has worked on projects with us, everything from employment, social care, and accessible rail travel. So Libby, we are so happy to have you here this evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here.
So I'm just going to ask a few questions just to start the game. And then I'm going to get Sophie and Ruth to join us and ask their questions. So you have written incredibly honestly and eloquently about, you know, the day everything changed. Do you mind telling us a little bit about what happened?
Yeah, of course. I wish I had a dramatic story. When people meet me for the first time and I'm in my wheelchair, they expect there to be a dramatic story about what happened to me. And I almost wish I made one up, because actually the reality is all I did is fall over on my way to work, literally. Broken pavement, I slipped, snapped some ligaments in my ankle. Should have been a simple 6-week recovery. Unfortunately, for reasons no one really understands, it became a nasty and very rare condition called complex regional pain syndrome, which causes constant nerve pain, basically. Very rare, very hard to treat. And it robbed me of my mobility. And as Sophie said earlier, you know, it changed everything in my world in that literal split second.
How have you rebuilt your life?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting one, because so I was older than Sophie when I had my accident. I was 34, and that was 10 years ago. So if you're very clever, you can do maths over how old I am now. But basically, so I had the opportunity to grow up without a disability. I'd gone to university, I'd had a career, I'd established a life for myself. And certainly for me, working was always absolutely central to who I was. I had to feel that I was making a difference. It's how I thought I could give back to the world, basically. And when I left TV, I'd actually moved into the charity sector to work in that environment. And so, interestingly, I knew a lot about disability and employment because I did it as a job. You know, it was something I was involved in. I understood the statistics, I understood the numbers, you know, I had the policy down. But the reality is, when it happened to me, I knew absolutely nothing about that experience. And what I find particularly incredible, and I still haven't really, 10 years on, got my head around this, is the fact that 6 weeks prior to my accident, I'd actually been job hunting. And, you know, I was viewed as an expert in my field. I had a range of job offers on the table. It was amazing. And I had this split-second accident and my world changed. And I went from being viewed as an expert to being completely unemployable. I could not get a job. Because the reality is, for me, like Sophie said really eloquently, the mobility issue is not my problem. For me particularly, and I know it happens for a lot of disabled people, my ability to function really varies. And that means, you know, I just don't know what the next day is gonna bring for me, how many hours I'm going to be able to give. And the world of work at the moment is just not set up for that in any way. There just aren't places like that. And I find it immensely frustrating that there's this wealth of talent and knowledge that is just being thrown away constantly.
So can I ask you the question I asked Sophie? What would you, and I think you probably will, from what I've heard from you, is it might be similar. What would be helpful to get rid of these barriers?
So in my career, I always worked in London. I worked in TV companies, I worked in Canary Wharf, and everywhere I worked, I never saw people with disabilities. They're just not there. And for me, it's really a piece around visibility that, you know, as you know, Sophie's talked about it really eloquently, but disabled people need to be out there. We need to be in work. We need to have these opportunities. You know, people need to know that disabled people exist beyond the Paralympics. Like, I love the Paralympics. I think it's wonderful, but you know, that's not all that we can do. We have so much more to offer.
Actually, some of us can't really get out of bed this morning. I think I should get a medal for going to work, actually, Ruth. But oh gosh, I should probably be serious again. Given that you are becoming more visible, how does it feel talking about yourself so publicly? What does it mean? What does it mean to you now? You're writing and campaigning, not just about yourself, but about other people.
It honestly means everything to me. Finding the opportunity to use my changed circumstances, not only as a way to write, but as a way to try and help people who are in the same situation that I am. It honestly it was the most important part of my recovery from my injury and my accident. It
Finding a
absolutely,
voice and a platform.
yeah, it gave me myself back. And literally every time, with everything I've written hundreds of articles and, you know, various things. Literally, if I only ever got one person say, yeah, that helped me, that would be enough. You know, that it would all be worth it.
Oh, well, then it's true, because you've helped me immensely. So thank you for writing. I was going to hand over the microphone to Sophie, because I know Sophie has some questions.
Libby, I think that listening there to you talk about the way in which you find talking about yourself so important, and so I guess healing. Did you I mean, is that something that you actually, would you have expected that, and do you think you'll continue that, to constantly write about your journey?
No, very early on when I started writing, I wrote a couple of pieces that explained my journey, and, you know, if anyone ever asks me, I refer them back to that. But what I find I do is I reflect on the new things I learn, because I think that when you do live with a disability, a chronic condition or whatever, you never stop that learning. I think you're constantly learning. Do you agree, Sophie?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And I think that's the thing that I find fascinating about living with a disability like you, is that people kind of assume that you get to a point where you've got it, and it's like, right, so now you've overcome it, what's it like? And you're like, no. I mean, there's constant learning, and there's constant, whether that's in yourself or society's perceptions around disability. And often I feel we make great strides forward, and then suddenly I think, no, we've still got a long way to go. So I think this journey is ever evolving, and my personal relationship with my disability is ever evolving as well, depending on my age, depending on who I meet, depending on what I'm doing. I
like your artist metaphor. I feel like we are artists because we have to reinvent all the time. But Libby, I think I actually stepped on your toes, because I know you had questions for Sophie too. Sorry about that.
Don't worry.
It's lovely to open it up.
It's a conversation.
And building what you just said, Sophie, obviously I write about my rare disability, but I know that you have your book coming out next year in which you've written about your own journey. I'd love to know how you found writing about yourself, and also what writing that memoir has meant to you.
Thanks, Libby. It's absolutely one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, and I feel like I've done a lot of hard things. I didn't set out to write a memoir about what had happened to me, but I found myself in lockdown, and like so many of us, I was very unsure about how I would manage. So I technically shielded for most of the year, and I had been given a book opportunity to write about something completely different, but that had got cancelled because of COVID. But I took the opportunity to reach back to the publishers and say, look, is there a way we could find a different route? And that's where they said, well, why not look back at what has happened? And so I sat down and started writing, and I've kept a diary most of my life, especially through my hospital time when I was rehabilitated. So I've got all that as a resource, and so off I went back into the past to really explore it. And it has been the hardest, but yet the most rewarding, and I think greatest achievement. It's not even published yet. It's going to be published next year. Well, however it does, I still feel it's the greatest achievement because it was so hard. And to your question about, you know, the process, I think for someone like me who acquired my disability and has gone on to do quite a range of wild and unexpected things, I found myself very much reflecting on the question around, would I change what has happened to me? Would I go back and do things differently if I could? And I really explored that hypothetical, you know, in my book, and my conclusions were not what I expected, or maybe they were. I don't know. It was very much a massive learning. But I go into some quite personal and also I think quite unexplored themes around identity, around sexuality, around relationships with my family, around relationships with my friends. It might, you know, finding meaning and purpose in work, and there was a lot I unpacked. So whether people choose to read it or not is one thing. It was an amazing experience to write, and I feel very much to your point about this idea that actually writing about it and increasing the visibility and giving very accurate representation of myself is one way I feel I'm fighting that battle to to greater equality around, or greater appreciation for the lives of disabled people. This is my way of saying, look, this is what happens to some people, and this is what happens, how we manage, you know. So yeah, that's why I've done it. So every time I check myself, I'm like, gosh, why am I doing this? Who am I writing this for? And why am I sharing this?
Oh no, we love it. We want more. We're going to get you back in when your book comes out. Don't worry.
Okay.
But I'm going to just warn you. We've only got about 15 to 20 minutes left. So Libby, if you have any more questions, this is a good time. And Ruth, if you've got any good questions up your sleeve.
Well, I've got a question. I've got a question for both Libby and Sophie, who I admire enormously. Is what role do you think charities and not-for-profits could play in giving disabled people a stronger platform and a stronger voice?
Good question.
Do you want to go first, Sophie, or shall I jump in?
Either way, don't mind. If you've got an answer, you can.
I've got.
Yeah. Okay, go Libby, go Libby.
Go me, I'll just take over. I personally, this is coming from my experience working in the world of disability with charities before, but I think there's a really interesting area that charities are uniquely able to do, which is engaging with corporate entities. Honestly, in my experience, both as a disabled person but also working, you know, in a disability charity on the other side of the fence, there's something really agile about charities, and really they're able to connect in a very meaningful way. I think a way that really makes corporate entities and people working in corporate entities actually get a very real, a very actual understanding of what disability is like. And for me, I think getting actually to those people on the ground, the recruiters, the managers, I think that's the first stage of, you know, getting more disabled people into the workplace, like actually changing those views. So I think that's one of the big areas where charities make a difference.
I agree. I tend to agree wholeheartedly with that, Libby. And Sophie, what about you?
Of course, I would add as well the small practical bits of advice and guidance that make such a fundamental difference to how empowered you feel. I mean, so for example, you know, being able to offer advice on how, you know, I mean, it could be as big as knowing your rights in the workplace and giving practical information around, you know, this is okay, this isn't okay, and these are the people you call if it's not. Or it can be, right, this is how you get a wheelchair. This is how we can guide you to, you know, support you when it comes to knowing how to book a train, book a taxi. I mean, these are like, I think those grassroots conversations, those grassroots communities, those areas there where you can sort of give very hands-on support and guidance, I think is so important, because I think the bigger picture around perceptions, around stigma and around issues like that, I think that's obviously the big work that has to be done. But so often I feel I get asked all the time by and I'm obviously not a charity, but I signpost to charities. I get asked these small basic questions, things like, how do I get access to be able to buy, Ruth, the machine that we've got that we click to our wheelchair that enables us to get to work. Now, I, for example, often talk about things like access to work, because people might not be aware of access to work. And it's not always a straightforward process and access to work, but when it works and when you get those resources, that can transform your ability to be able to get to work, to feel confident at work. I mean, my bike, Ruth, your bike, I use that to go to work. And then access to work is also paid for a support worker for me to be able to go and do a lot of the work I do. So yes, in summary, I think that the small things charities can really support.
I completely agree, because I've just been out on my scoot today. I went past down your road today.
Oh.
So you know, it's transformed my life. It's changed my life. I've seen parts of London that, quite frankly, I would never have seen in any other way. So very great points, both of you. And I think, you know, we should at LC take them on board and think about how we feed that into our future work that we do.
Thank you. I think such good. I feel like we could go on for 2 hours, but I'm just going to say now we're going to open the conversation even wider, and we're going over to our chat room, where I think Lucy's in a cupboard somewhere trying to get signal. Lucy is getting our question and answers from our audience tonight. So Lucy, over to you. Do you have some good questions coming in?
Oh, Lucy's muted.
Oh, she'll come back soon.
There's always one, isn't there? There's always one who does it in the end.
Never learn. We've been using Zoom for we'll never learn.
We've got lots of questions coming in, and funnily enough, some of them are about tanks. And the first question that's been asked, actually, Libby, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what this tank was and what that story is?
Obviously, I mean, doesn't everyone talk about tanks all day? I mean, so back in the depths of history in the noughties, I worked on a show for BBC Two called How to Start Your Own Country with a wonderful TV presenter called Danny Wallace. And we actually set up a brand new country in his little flat in Bow in East London. And obviously, what do you do when you set up a new country? You go and tell the countries you have borders with that, you know, that you're there. So we decided that the only way to deliver our Declaration of Independence to Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister, was to do it in style and take a tank to 10 Downing Street, which we did. They were expecting us. The guys with machine guns did look slightly worried when we turned up. So we got rid of the tank pretty sharpish and then just waited and kick. But yes, you know, completely. Sophie, you know about the ridiculousness of working in TV, I'm sure. So.
Yep, nothing surprises me. Although that is quite pretty impressive.
So, Lucy, I've seen some interesting questions coming up. Lucy, any more?
Yes, I do. I actually have a very interesting question here from Anna, actually, which I think is really a good one to talk about. What do you think about the longevity of the campaigns to launch during the Paralympics, for example, like We the 15? And she feels like they've dropped off the map. And would love to hear what you guys think about how we can encourage sustainability of those campaigns.
Couldn't agree more. I worry about longevity. I worry about impact. I worry about all of those things as well. But from what I've learned about, for example, we'll take We the 15 just because I mentioned it and now it's being asked about. There are frameworks being integrated into the next Paralympics in Paris, into LA, and beyond that are not being shouted about, but are very much happening and going on behind the scenes. I think to this, we do need to worry about longevity, and we do need to worry about campaigns, you know, having their moment and then fizzling out and not really, what are the metrics for success with these campaigns? Absolutely we do, but I also think that that's where the likes of people like myself and other advocates and other charities put the pressure on and call out, right, where are we? What's going on here? People need to be held to account, whatever campaign that is. And I think also there needs to be much more transparency around what are the metrics for each campaign and when are we measuring them and what, you know, are we going to announce them? So I think that, yeah, I mean, I singled out We the 15, but we could look at so many of the other campaigns that launch around the Paralympics or come and go in the Paralympic cycle as well, that really we need to start asking harder questions of these campaigns. What are they actually for and what are they actually doing? But We the 15, I can speak from with some insight that there are things going on, but just they don't seem to be so public as they were around the games.
Thank you. I feel like I'd love to launch into my own diatribe, but I will refrain. Lucy, back to you.
Yes, I have another question coming at you right now, which is another really interesting question that has lots of talking points to it. This is from Claire, who works for a large financial institution, and she's been employed there for 20 years. She's disabled, and she's constantly exceeding her yearly appraisals, but gets no promotion. And she's trained people up who are earning more money than she is. And her company is all about a diversity inclusion thing that is really at the forefront of everyone's minds. But she's kind of thinking, how come disability is still being dismissed and ignored when it comes to this inclusion question? And how can we challenge this?
Well, I could say a lot about this, but I think, you know, from a personal point of view, I think, you know, for Claire, then, you know, she should be champion. You know, the fact that she's been overlooked and everything is scandalous, quite frankly. And, you know, I experienced a bit of that in my tech career, but I wouldn't stand for it. I always put myself up and was a bit, to Sophie's point, was my own advocate. I think disability has slipped down the agenda in inclusion, and we need to put it right up there on the agenda. So, you know, as Leonard Cheshire, we're going to be an employer of disabled people and be proud of it. It's going to be our number one priority as we look to recruit talent through the next years, over the next years. And I don't know if we've got our chair on this webinar today, but he would be saying exactly the same as me, David Grayson. So, you know, I think things have to change for the disabled community. It has to change. It's wrong. We're left behind as a minority group, and we need to be up there. It needs to be equal, and if anything, it needs to be a number one priority for many organisations on the inclusion agenda.
It feels like we haven't got the civil rights that other groups have fought for. And even though there was a huge movement in the 90s and Nothing About Us Without Us, it sort of slipped back on the agenda, certainly in government worlds. So I really think there is a space for us. I really feel there's a space.
Most definitely.
To have a voice. I'm just going to time check. We've got about 8 minutes. So Lucy, we've probably got enough time for another 2 questions.
Well, that's lovely, because I do have another question that's coming up. And just so you know, Ruth, I've just had a message from David, who is here. And he says, here to Ruth. And I have another really interesting question for you. How can we make sure that our push for disability employment avoids playing into the myth that disabled people are only valuable if they're productive? Now, how can we make sure that we're holding companies accountable to not just hiring disabled people, but also making spaces welcoming for disabled people? And again, that's from Anna, which I think is a really good one.
Sophie, do you want to go for that one?
I just actually I was going to try and send a message, so I didn't actually hear the full question. Apologies. I was sending a text because I wanted to get the name of the girl or a woman who just messaged about that. I wanted to follow up on that.
I've got her permission to do this. The lady who's asking is a really interesting lady. She is the Marshall Scholar at LSE, and she's here for 2 years looking at international and disability studies. And she also is, I think the word protege is the right word, of Judy Heumann in the States. So she is a woman of great knowledge and exceptional interest in the subject. So I'm so excited that she joined us tonight. Thank you, Anna. I know we can't wave at you, but we're waving at you.
So how can we make the environment in which people work more welcoming and accessible?
I mean, it's the biggest question of all. I think if it comes down to how to make a workspace more welcoming, I often look back on this point I tried to articulate earlier, which is this idea around the perceptions of what a disabled person is. And I often ask people, when you hear that word disabled, what do you think of, right? What comes up in your mind? And if it's not a positive image, what is it? Because I have come to redefine my version of what disability means now. And I look at disabled people, and I said this earlier, I see us as extraordinary beings that are artistic in their approach to life, with so much creativity as one trait. But I also think that disabled people possess in abundance so many other very, very valuable traits that make them maybe not productive, but very, very valuable in a workspace. But we don't seem to make space for that. So whether it be, you know, I talk about creativity, but problem solving. I mean, disabled people problem solve just without even, you know, without giving it too much thought. You just have to be problem solving all the time. It's part of our day-to-day lives, navigating the world. And I think that what we need to move away from is, you know, working long and hard is not what we really need in a workspace. We need other people to come in with other things and build a team where what you bring, you know, meets the traits of somebody else, and so you will work collectively to progress a workspace. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is I want us to try and find a way to redefine what we think disabled people bring. And it doesn't need to be how many hours we could sit in an office. It's actually, you know, productivity is meant to go up. There's some studies, I need to look into these a bit more, but I've heard people talk about studies in which if you bring disabled people into the workspace, productivity as a whole is lifted across the board. So what does that mean? And can we get into that and find out what that means? And how do we, you know, use that as a starting point to say, we bring so much to the table, so make space. You know, I suppose that's my answer, but I could go on. I'll let Libby jump in.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to just give us one more question, Lucy, because I think we're going to have to wrap up soon. We've got about 5 minutes left.
Right, well, this question is coming from, let me have a look. We've just got another one popping up. This is from Jack. What changes do you think should be made to like art classes and youth groups to be more accessible for young disabled people? Which I think is a really nice one, because Sophie, as an artist, you will know about.
Shall I jump in? I mean,
please do. Go ahead, Sophie.
What do we need to make art spaces more accessible, youth spaces more accessible? Money. We need local councils to be given power to spend money in the places that they need it. And I mean, geez, it's very, again, we also need to have accessible equipment. You know, assistive devices are very expensive. We need to find ways to have those provided and subsidized where they can't be. And it's, again, I mean, it does seem like it comes back to a matter of resources, but perhaps we need to think about the flip side of that, because that's an obvious one. Maybe it's also about attitude. And, you know, it doesn't take often a huge amount to make a space accessible. Often I feel myself going as a wheelchair user into environments where you kind of go, do you know, actually, this is more accessible than you think if you just did a little bit of this, a little bit of that, you know, or had a conversation with the person that's wanting to access that space and say, what do you need? Can we find a way around it? There's a lot of compliance and fear around, you know, making sure you meet the criteria legislatively, and you know, make sure that you're ticking all the right boxes when it comes to making a space accessible. But often it's not as much as you think. And I think that, so yeah,
I agree, Sophie. I am so with you. I'm going to slightly wrap this up. Libby, as you will, I'm going to ask you to give your final thoughts. Do you agree with Sophie?
Yeah, I think so. I totally agree that, you know, money is the challenge, but also just those conversations. It's quite interesting, sort of having worked in the disability space and become a disabled person, that I can almost understand the sort of fear there about just asking a disabled person what they need, because people are so terrified of saying the wrong thing or offending someone, that it means that actually sometimes there's just the fear to ask those questions. And I think just having those simple, open communications at every level can make a vast difference.
Thank you. Ruth, can I ask you to give your closing comments?
I think it's influencing the town planners and the architects and all those people before they start to build these spaces as well. It's actually influencing everybody there to ensure that they think about accessibility. You know, it's designed for independence, isn't it? It's thinking about that at the outset and not having it tagged on at the end, or trying to fit something, you know, create something and then trying to make it accessible. It's like, really? How does that work? So we thought about it at the outset, and we were inclusive and we represented the communities that we all live in, then I think the world would be a much better place.
Thank you. Well, I have to bring this to an end, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very sorry, because I feel we could keep going. I know, Ruth, you wanted to say a few words before we close the webinar.
Well, I did, and I wanted to just say thank you to both, you know, Libby and Sophie. You've been great panelists, and I just wanted to, you know, say I've really enjoyed listening to you. Done a bit like Selena, I could listen to you both forever, and I follow you avidly anyway. So I want to say, if you want to get involved in the pioneering circle, I really welcome it. I want to hear the voices and views of disabled people, but more importantly, of our partners and supporters and volunteers. That's hugely important to myself and the team at Leonard Cheshire. So I just want to say thank you for everything. Thank you for giving up your time this evening. Thank you for listening to us about more widely disabled people's, you know, challenges and opportunities, but also listening to our invaluable work at Leonard Cheshire. And to both Libby and Sophie, a massive thank you. And I look forward to jetting past you, Sophie, in the street. And hopefully we'll have 5 minutes to be able to talk. And Libby, I'd love to meet you as well. But thank you to everybody.
Ruth and our panelists, thank you. I promise to get you out of here by 7 o'clock. So it's just hit 7 o'clock and we've done it. I really hope you guys enjoyed tonight. And if you'd like to find out more about Leonard Cheshire, here comes the spiel, our work. And if you want to get involved with it, please do respond to the email that you will get after this event. and we love feedback. We love ideas. Just so you know, a recording of the event will be sent to you afterwards, again, with the email that you registered with. But if you have any more questions that we didn't get time to get to tonight, please send it to this our email, which is supporterevent@leonardcheshire.org. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Libby. You're so articulate and wonderful, both of you. I want more. So we might have to have another one in February. You've been warned. And thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Leonard Cheshire. Find out more at leonardcheshire.org.